was such a beautiful, unique building.
Excitement, the grandeur, you were in something that was stupendous.
I can remember as a young child going to the terminal and being just awestruck by the hugeness of it.
The major dramatic events in people's personal lives and histories took place through this building.
Terminal, I proposed to my wife.
We chose the Central Terminal as the location for our wedding.
The first time I went back and saw all the destruction that had been done, it was heartbreaking.
It would speak volumes if we could go ahead and restore it to its grandeur.
I think that the work they're doing is really fantastic.
This is a history of Buffalo. We're lucky that it's still there.
We are correcting a historic wrong that has been done to this building.
It's often called Buffalo's most beloved building. Towering 17 stories above the east side, the Central Terminal stands as both a reminder of the city's vibrant past and a promise for a brighter future. By the early 1900s, Buffalo, New York was recognized as one of the most important cities in the bustling railroad industry. Situated at the convergence of the Great Lakes and the Erie Canal, halfway between Chicago and New York, Buffalo was the second largest rail center in the United States. The city was a vital hub, easing the movement of freight and passengers to the east and the west. The New York Central Railroad dominated passenger traffic, but with competing railroads building new stations in downtown Buffalo to meet increasing demand, the New York Central faced pressure to follow suit. Politicians favored downtown Buffalo as the site of the new station. New York Central wasn't interested. Real estate was scarce, and trains would have trouble maneuvering at the edge of Lake Erie. They chose instead to build their station on the east side of Buffalo, 2.5 miles from the heart of downtown. Most believed that the city would soon expand to encompass the site. Construction of the Central Terminal began in 1927. Renowned railroad architects Alfred Fellheimer and Stuart Wagner were commissioned to design the building. Known for their large-scale passenger railroad structures, the two men complemented one another. Fellheimer was most noted for his concern with aesthetics, while Wagner was much more production-minded. They chose the Art Deco style for the Buffalo Central Terminal to capture the futuristic modern aura of the railroads.
The Central Terminal is a supreme example of Art Deco, and probably one of the two most important examples in Western New York, the other being Buffalo City Hall, which is an astonishing Art Deco building of the same era. Art Deco would often combine very simple, strong forms, such as the tower, for example, or very large arches and openings with great areas of glass, so that you have the impression of something that's quite monumental, because the scale is very grand. The volumes are soaring spaces, and it's that simplicity that is inherent in the detailing of Art Deco that gives you the sense that we're really in the modern era. We're not lost in history.
Art Deco makes heavy use of symbolic icons. The Central Terminal was once filled with representations of the speed and modernism associated with train travel at this time.
And you see castings of wheels, train wheels with wings on the wheels. Devices such as that would represent a feeling of contemporariness, a looking to the future. To have a building of this magnitude, both its size, its scale, and the architectural quality that it has, is really a testimonial to that moment in our history.
Construction took more than 2 years. The Buffalo Central Terminal held its grand opening celebration on June 22, 1929. Over 2,000 business and civic leaders attended a Chamber of Commerce luncheon held on the concourse. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, the first train, the Empire State Express, departed, headed eastbound. By midnight, a full schedule was already in place. 2 200 trains ran through the terminal daily. Just 4 months later, the stock market crashed, plunging the nation into an economic depression.
Commerce practically ground to a halt. You had about 35% unemployment in the city of Buffalo alone. And so the building got off on a difficult footing.
Train transportation, like everything else, struggled for years to recover. When the United States entered World War II, the Central Terminal saw a resurgence.
The Second World War had a major impact on the Central Terminal because train travel was paramount to moving, men, materials for the war effort. And I think even more so for Buffalo, the Central Terminal then really became embedded in people's consciousness. I've always said that of a particular age, the major dramatic events in people's personal lives and histories took place through this building. People saw their sons leave and never saw them again. People came here to meet relatives, to send relatives off. People left for college. We've gotten some really heart-rendering letters from people telling us about how they stood at the Bison and waited for their husbands to come home after 3.5 years in the service. So that's the beginning of Buffalo's intimate relationship between the large historical events that have occurred in our lives and in our nation's lives and this building playing a pivotal role in that. If you really think about it, a building like this back then was the prototype of them all. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, restaurants, coffee shops, florists, jewelers, taxi cabs, all kinds of accommodations and services and shoe shines and a locksmith and a liquor store. I mean, it was a hub of activity.
After the war, train travel steadily declined as the popularity of the automobile and airplane grew. Railroads were mandated to continue running unprofitable routes with no federal assistance. Instead, the government chose to subsidize other transportation industries. New York Central faced economic hardship. In 1968, they merged with the Pennsylvania Railroad to form the Penn Central, which then assumed operation of the Buffalo Terminal. 3 years later, Amtrak was formed to take over passenger service from ailing Northeast railroads. Amtrak operated out of the terminal until the end of the decade.
I lived here when the last train left in October of 1979, and I don't recall it being a big story. So the demise of the Central Terminal in Buffalo was not with a bang, it was with a whimper. I think train travel was diminishing to such a capacity that it just sort of withered on the vine. Sad, really.
Amtrak constructed a station several miles away in Depew to handle passenger transportation. Several years later, the Buffalo Central Terminal was sold to a private owner, Anthony Fedeli.
He did not do too much stripping to it. He pretty much kept it intact.
Tony Fedeli was a very nice man in way over his head. He didn't have the financing or backing to do anything with the terminal. He actually built himself an apartment in the building and lived up on the terminal. So he really loved the building, but couldn't do anything with it.
And unfortunately, he never had a plan. I mean, very quickly they began selling off all the file cabinets and the office equipment that was left here. A lot of the institutional capacity in the building, offices and insurance people, they hung around for a while. They were here 6 months, 9 months. The transition wasn't overnight.
Anthony Fedeli owned the building for several years, but eventually filed for bankruptcy. Because he was unable to pay the property taxes, the city foreclosed.
In 1986, the city sold the building at auction for $100,000. A man named Thomas Telesco bought it.
Now that was something they never should have done, because once you put it on the auction, anybody can come in and bid on it.
He thought there would be a wedding palace. He had initially good ideas, but he turned to be the great destroyer. Because when he took this building over, it was a turnkey operation. It could have walked in, and you could have just used it, a couple of cosmetic things, and you'd be in business. I thought the cannibalization of the interior of the Central Terminal was a crime. Radiators were pulled out. The Art Deco wall sconces, the bison and marble pulled off walls. The clock was taken out and sold so money could be made by this individual.
These fixtures were so nice. They've gone all over the world. I was in Hong Kong last year. I was in this restaurant, and I couldn't believe it. I'm reading this plaque, and it says, "This fixture originally came from the Central Terminal in Buffalo, New York."
The third private owners, Samuel and Bernard Tuckman, were interested in establishing a call center in the terminal. They purchased the building from Telesco in 1994. Though it had been declared a National Historic Landmark 10 years earlier, the building continued to decline under their ownership.
Just because a building is a National Historic Landmark doesn't mean that the interior is protected. It only protects the exterior of the building, so the owners had the opportunity to do what they wanted on the inside. From Tony Fedeli to a Telesco and a Tuckman, they literally raped and destroyed the place in 20 years. They sold everything. They took every doorknob in the building and sold it. Their night watchmen spent their evenings ripping copper pipes out of the walls to sell for scrap metal. They had this major historic responsibility, and they really didn't have the means, nor the plan, nor capacity. How would you intend to operate this building and not be a not-for-profit and still have to pay taxes? The unfortunate thing is the city of Buffalo literally could have had an Art Deco masterpiece under lock and key that they could have then promoted to any developer they wanted to. And the really sad part is, up until the early 90s, a lot of this building was still pretty much intact. The lighting fixtures were still here. A lot of the decorative ornamentation that the building was known for was still in place. The clock was still here. The city of Buffalo's major concern with this property has been this: to never be in the chain of title. They never wanted to be responsible. And so they let people buy it who had no plan. The demise of the Central Terminal was the result of the lack of imagination, the lack of vision by the city of Buffalo.
The disinvestment that it left in its wake is just extremely significant, and the decline of the terminal has sort of been a very visible, almost a beacon of decline in a way, because it can be seen from so far away. It's significant in the fact that it mirrors the rise and fall of the city itself.
During the years the Central Terminal was under the control of private ownership, East Side community groups worked to improve the neighborhood. They brought complaints of the condition of the terminal to City Housing Court.
And the city court had to hear the case against Tuckman for owning a dilapidated building after Telesco had already left. So Tuckman was told to surrender the building or face a jail sentence. So he surrendered the building to the Central Terminal Restoration Corporation.
One day we're walking out of housing court. He says to me, "Well, you're so interested in the building, why don't you take it for $1?" And I don't know who was more surprised, him or me, when I pull my wallet out and say, "Okay, you're on." It was probably a crazy thing to do when I took on the ownership, but somebody had to do it.
Scott Field, then housing director for the Polish Community Center, became the first president of the newly formed Central Terminal Restoration Corporation, founded in 1997.
The main role of the Restoration Corporation was essentially to be the caretaker for the building, to make sure the building was sealed up and secured, and to make sure that no further damage happened to it, and to try and find a good reuse for the building.
Restoring a building or a complex on the scale of Central Terminal wouldn't be possible without a guiding corporation such as the Central Terminal Restoration Corporation. What they do is they are able to create the vision. A viable, feasible vision must be in place. The corporation, which is a not-for-profit corporation, is also then a legal vehicle to receive monies, because without the corporation, you don't get that critical mass of people and brains that are needed for a project of this scale.
When the Central Terminal Restoration Corporation was formed, one of the first things they did with a small amount of money that they got was to determine, is the building structurally sound? If it was not, then any restoration efforts or preservation would have been fruitless.
After it was determined that the structure of the building was not compromised, the Restoration Corporation established a plan to commence their work on the property.
They made the decision that, number one is, you're in a neighborhood here. You've got to be a good neighbor. And in the beginning, when they had no money, literally, what they did do, they did these things. They knew, number one, is that if anybody got in the building and got hurt or killed accidentally, they'd lose the project. So what they did is they needed to secure the building. So they did that. They cinder blocked a lot of secondary entrances in, they put a security system in the building, and they put a fence around it to keep people away. We needed to protect people from their own curiosity. And the other thing that we could do with just manpower and effort was to keep the grass cut and the garbage picked up, because in the beginning, this was an illegal dumping ground for everybody.
The Central Terminal Restoration Corporation received a relatively modest grant to begin the process of mothballing the building. The critical things to do were to seal the building so that water could no longer enter, to seal the windows with plywood in most cases so that people could no longer smash the windows, secure the entrances, and secure the main concourse roof, which is the great arched construction, which was leaking very badly. So that was the first order of business, and that took quite a bit of time because the scale of the building is so large.
I've received people saying, just tear it down. Why is this building is just an albatross? Get rid of it. Well, one estimate would be $16 million to tear down for land that really doesn't have much value. The early estimate that we had from Hamilton, Houston, Lowney of repair 10 years ago was about $60 million. If this building were abandoned, if the Central Terminal were to throw the keys and saying, we're just giving it up, it'd be a big city headache. It'd be a dilapidating, corroding, falling building. We'd be forced to tear it down and wipe out 10 years of demolition budgets. So the Central Terminal Restoration Corporation Incorporated is doing a great service to the city of Buffalo.
You know, the terminal sort of represents a lot of the trials and the tribulations, so to speak, of what the city has been through. You know, it was built on this promise of grandeur, and then it suffered tremendously in the past, but there's now a committed group of citizens who are working towards its rebirth. And I think one of the ways they've done that is this slow incremental progress. You know, they've sort of ramped up a little bit each year. They're not reaching for the silver bullet projects. They're not seeking $150 million tomorrow to turn it around.
I think the idea of restoring a building or reconstructing a building in a phased way is probably the only feasible way of doing it in this day and age.
I think that the work they're doing is really fantastic, and the fact that they've been able to sustain this for a decade now is truly remarkable.
Volunteers for the Central Terminal Restoration Corporation do a couple of things. They basically do actually physical work here. They literally have cleaned rooms and cleaned spaces, and we're talking paint and sanding and debris removal and removing the broken glass. All the kiosks that surround the concourse have been cleaned and restored by volunteers, and they also man all the events.
I mean, if you walk in there now and you look around, and if you'd been there when it was, you know, still in one piece, it's very discouraging. Very discouraging. Each year they have more and more people come through the place, and more people are volunteering.
There is no Central Terminal Restoration Corporation unless there's volunteers.
The Restoration Corporation's efforts were geared towards reintroducing the public to the Central Terminal. New York State Assemblyman Paul Tokaz secured a $15,000 grant to restore the iconic exterior tower clocks. The clocks were relit to great public acclaim in October of 1999.
I was really struck by the number of people that I think there was a little bit of a press announcement. We didn't really make a big thing of it, and the hundreds of people that showed up, not just from the community, but from the suburban community who would have that attachment, and they read about it. It was just very gratifying that people were that interested in that building, and I think that's what you'll hear constantly from folks, is that it's such a great building. We do need to find a way to reuse it.
It also is, again, another symbol, a real physical symbol that the building's worst days are over, and it's rebuilding itself, and it's revitalizing itself with the work of the volunteers.
One of the most memorable fixtures of the Central Terminal was the iconic bison that stood in the center of the concourse.
And it was known either internationally, but certainly nationally, that the saying was, meet you at the bison. And you didn't need to say what city.
The mythology goes that when the boys were leaving for World War II, they'd pluck a little bit of fur from that bison and stick it in their wallets, a little reminder of home, and very quickly began getting a bear behind. Now, when we had the 75th anniversary, we thought it'd be great to bring him back, and we found that he still existed, and he was at the Science Museum, and we brought him here. on a flatbed trailer wrapped up in plastic. We sort of hung on to them going down Fillmore Avenue. It was great fun. And what's interesting, but most people don't realize this simple fact, is that the bison from the Science Museum was here primarily as an advertisement. You've got a 3-hour layover on your train. The museum's just down the street. Hop in a cab, you're there in 5 minutes. It was an advert promoting the Science Museum. And then ultimately, when the original stuffed one went back to the Science Museum, it was replaced with a